All right, today, straight after, guys, I know it's Monday for some of you guys. You may read this video later, but it's all about the test. It's all about how we make this all happen. It's about what does the average Australian normally do as part of their life cycle? What does the average Australian prepare themselves for retirement? So the average Australian does this sort of life cycle, right? This being death, this being retirement. The average Australian intends to retire before they die. That doesn't always happen. It's not always the case. And that's because of lack of preparation. Because what normally happens here, let's assume this is the start of your working life. The working life cycle, right? Let's assume at this stage, people get a deposit together, they buy a house. Later in that career, remember we talked about that 10-year cycle for the average person. So then what they do is they pay off their mortgage or downsize. The average person won't pay off their mortgage, they'll probably downsize. And it's at this point they start questioning, how am I going to retire? They give themselves this small window to actually start focusing. They start doing things like salary sacrificing, which is putting money into your superannuation. For those of you who don't know, superannuation is a government mandatory investment account that people are forced to have their employers put money into. So I know that's poorly explained, but when you're working in Australia, a minimum of 9% or 9.5% nowadays from your wages is put into what's called a superannuation account. That superannuation account is invested for your retirement. You cannot touch it until you meet what's called a conditional piece of retirement or to a sole purpose test age 65 to 67, depending on where you are and when you were born. Generally, from here to here, it is very poorly looked after. What that means is people don't even know where it is. People don't know where it's invested. They don't know anything about superannuation. They don't know anything about how they're actually going to retire. They just hope the government has done their calculations adequately and that 9% is sufficient. This is not always the case. Self-employed neglect this. People who have, for example, working people who have children and take some leave off work, take a big chunk out of their working career, right, to do so. People in bad situations take money out of the superannuation. This is a consistent cycle where people, we're finding, in our particular company, are getting towards this point where that $300,000 or less inside superannuation. A large majority. Now, with the average income of Australians being $70,000, how long are they set to live off these funds? 3 years? Now, in this life cycle, people start focusing on the last 7 years for retirement, right? Which is the exact opposite of what they need to do. And the reason for that is this. Mr. and Mrs. Client, if you have two investments, let's just call them investment properties. They are worth $1 million each. The market goes to absolute poo and these values half. They have $500,000 now left. Is that correct? Yes, they have. They've got half their asset. They're worth $500,000. Can you still buy your groceries? Can you still buy your dinner? Can you still buy your lunch? The answer is yes. If the average Australian loses half their net worth, they can still eat their food, because the only way you actually lose the money is if you sell it, is if you sell the asset. Because what happens is if you have time and you don't need to sell this asset, you can wait. You can wait till the value comes back up, because as there's cycles, it goes up, down, up, down. And what happens is if you've got time during this down period, you can wait for it to come back up. This is an extremely important point. Why? Because if you have now 7 years to retire, what happens if it takes longer than 7 years to come back up? Are you forced to sell short? Yes, you are. Because you need the money, and that's when people lose money. Because if you are starting this process here, younger, that it can go down and up as much as it wants, as long as when you're ready to retire, you have an opportunity to sell at a greater point. You're not held accountable by time. The average statistics show if you start taking care of your assets at age 23 to 65, if you get 1% benefit on all your investments or on your superannuation balance from age 23 to 65, that's a benefit in Australian currency of $400,000. $400,000 on 1%. Do you guys know what 1% is? Just understanding and having a educated approach to your financial future. So Mr. and Mrs. Klein, do you want an educated approach or do you want a generic approach to your financial future? And this is what it comes down to. That life cycle is tainted because the average person starts 7 years to go, 6 years to go, 5 years to go. And you're going to ask the client that question because I'm going to tell you guys, I'm going to give you guys a calculator, which Tim can or cannot ask you guys to use. That's absolutely his prerogative. He is the professional, guys. Trust him and you'll be extremely successful. But in this context, if we give a shorter period of time, then obviously it's less results. 1% each year for the next 35 years, 40 years is a lot easier to achieve than the next 7 years getting 15 to 20%. Right? Because in that 15 to 20%, you're going to have downturns. When you're chasing higher returns, you're taking higher risks. You cannot afford to be taking higher risks if there is a lower period of time. Does that make sense, guys? Perfect. All right, next video.